Last week, we dove into the claims that America's F-117 Nighthawk, the world's first operational stealth aircraft and a jet that's been retired since 2008, may have secretly returned to combat over the Middle East as recently as 2017. We covered the F-117's unique technology and capability set, and determined that there really may have been practical reason to bring this legendary black jet back into the fight, even in this era of more advanced and broadly capable stealth aircraft like the F-35 and F-22. Namely, the Nighthawk's ability to operate with impunity inside contested airspace while striking even moving targets with laser-guided munitions, a capability no other stealth aircraft in America's arsenal had at that time. This week, we're going to delve deeper into how these operations over Syria may have really played out, how the world found out about them, and whether or not we ultimately think these claims are true or just stealthy flights of fancy. So let's dive into this. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. Last week, we talked about a Russian Su-35 performing an unsafe and unprofessional maneuver in front of a US Air Force F-16, while the American fighters were intercepting a pair of Russian nuclear-capable bombers and their fighter escorts off the coast of Alaska. And you guys know what time it is. I want to talk about ground news and why it's not just an excellent tool for staying on top of what's going on in the world, but it's also a great way to see how an outlet's interests and biases can affect the way they present the news to you. And nowhere are these comparisons more stark than when looking at the imperfect free press of the Western world as compared to the strictly controlled Russian state media. Here in the coverage details, I can see that 129 news outlets covered this story last week. And when you scroll down, you can see every instance of this story being covered, including the headline, whether or not that outlet is state affiliated, its political bias, its ownership, and even its factuality rating. With outlets like Russia Today using headlines like, "Watch Russian fighter jet push US F-16 away from nuclear bomber." But literally right beneath it, and with the same political leanings, I can see coverage out of France and India, running headlines like, "A Russian fighter flies dangerously close to a US Air Force F-16," and "Close shave, Russian fighter jet flies dangerously within feet of US F-16 near Alaska." These headlines, as you can see, present a very different perspective. But one of my favorite tools that ground news gives me isn't just about holding news outlets accountable, it's about holding me accountable for my own media consumption. And that is the My News Bias portion of their website, which gives you a breakdown of what types of content you consume and what types of biases that might expose you to. Right here on the My News Bias page, you can see that of the roughly 100 stories I've used ground news to review recently, 32 of them came from left-leaning outlets. 30 came from right-leaning outlets, and 41 came from centrist outlets. I can see what percentage of these news outlets are independent versus which ones are media conglomerates, and so much more. And if you want to get in on this, just go to ground.news/Sandboxx with 2 X's to get 40% off the same Vantage plan that I use every day. Again, that's ground.news/Sandboxx to get 40% off their Vantage plan to help you stay on top of things. On March 2nd, 2019, Scramble magazine took to Facebook with a lengthy post that was mostly focused on recent pictures of F-117s flying over Death Valley National Park, taken by aviation photographer Dan Stijevich. But amid their discussions of the F-117's post-retirement service over the United States, they also included a single paragraph about the long-standing rumors of Nighthawks actually getting back into the fight. I'll read that to you directly. Back in 2017, and not published by any other source so far, Scramble received very reliable information that at least 4 F-117s were deployed to the Middle East as an operational need emerged for the US Air Force to resurrect the stealth F-117 for special purposes. One of the deployed aircraft was involved in an in-flight emergency and landed far away from its temporary home base that was likely located in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, or Qatar. During this extremely covert deployment, the 4 Nighthawks flew missions over Syria and Iraq with small-diameter bombs. Now, it isn't a ton to go off of, but Scramble's reputation for being a serious and well-sourced outlet stood in stark contrast to the much more easily dismissed forum posts and Reddit comments this tale had been relegated to in the past. And as we discussed last week, there was at least a good reason for these Nighthawks to get back into combat. Despite retiring 16 years ago now, F-117s are still actively flying in air combat exercises over the US, playing the roles of adversary stealth fighters and even low observable cruise missiles against a variety of in-service fighters. So we know that at least a handful of the 45 or so Nighthawks kept in what's called Type 1000 flyable storage since their retirement are still in flight and maybe even fight-ready condition. We also know the F-117's ability to carry laser-guided weapons like the GBU-12, capable of engaging even moving targets via the Nighthawk's onboard laser designator, was unique among America's in-service stealth aircraft at the time, with the F-35 carrying the necessary hardware for the job, but not the software until 2019. And because of the complex geopolitical situation over Syria during this period, the US found itself not only contending with ISIS in the region, but a variety of Russian threats as well, ranging from tactical aircraft to their most advanced air defense systems. If this were a murder mystery, one could argue then that we've already established both motive and opportunity. But before we delve deeper into the nuts and bolts of this story, let's go back to Scramble, who posted a lengthier update to their claims with some more details to pore over on April 10th of 2019. In this new post, Scramble claimed to have spoken with an undisclosed number of witnesses from at least 2 countries other than the United States who witnessed an F-117 make an emergency landing at Ali Al Salam Air Base in Kuwait, the closest Allied fixed-wing airstrip south of the Iraqi border. I'm going to quote that post now. During the mentioned landing, which occurred during dawn, the unfortunate Nighthawk was accompanied by its wingman. The latter did not land at Ali El Salam Air Base, but continued its route to its deployment base. This scene was seen by some lucky OIR personnel. One of these personnel managed to make a poor quality long-distance iPhone picture of the chase landing of the 2 birds, followed by the broken aircraft parked at one of the aprons of Ali El Salam. Without any doubt, this was at Ali El Salam, as infrastructure characteristics and then deployed aircraft to Ali El Salam were clearly identified together with the broken F-117A. The post then goes on to address something of an inconsistency in this story that you may have already picked up on if you know your ordnance. In the story, these F-117s were alleged to be using small-diameter bombs, also known as GBU-39s, to engage moving targets in contested Syrian airspace. This is an issue for at least 2 reasons, the first being that the F-117 was never equipped to carry GBU-39s, and the second being that GBU-39s use a combination of GPS and inertial guidance that, at the time, would be largely ineffective against moving targets. In fact, these are precisely the kinds of weapons that the F-35 or F-22 could have already carried into the fight at this time. Scramble explains this issue away by positing that the witnesses may have said small diameter bomb because those were the most common weapons used in the region at the time, sort of the same way people call a wide variety of soda Coke. But they also allowed for the possibility that the F-117 may have integrated these weapons at some point during its post-retirement flying career. And while that is certainly possible, it just wouldn't make a great deal of sense to me. Why bring the F-117 back into operational service to carry the same munitions you could already employ from more advanced and modern stealth aircraft? It makes more sense to me that these witnesses may have simply been wrong about the types of munitions it was carrying. Of course, it is also possible that these F-117s came back into service because of their ability to use laser-guided munitions, but also integrated GPS-guided weapons like the GBU-39 in order to maximize their capability set. Of course, all of this assumes this story is true. I'll get back to Scramble's post. The deployment base was most probably in Qatar or Saudi Arabia. We can confirm that they flew only during nighttime, and strikingly, they used the call sign Heli, or H-E-L-I. This name was most probably chosen as Heli gave less attention in the air tasking order of OIR, that is, observed by many military. As known, several secretive helicopter operations also took place throughout the whole OIR area of operations. Strikingly, the F-117 flight through Death Valley used Lehi, or L-E-H-I, as a call sign. According to Scramble, the Nighthawks also saw combat against ISIS in Iraq. I'll quote them one more time. As the F-117s possibly returned due to unfinished business, the Nighthawks were also used over the densely populated Mosul area, with narrow streets and fortified bunkers during the Battle of Mosul. As we discussed last week, and I mentioned just a few minutes ago, Scramble claims to have gotten to see direct photographic evidence of this emergency landing, taken from an iPhone from one of the witnesses, though they were unable to publish the photos for obvious security reasons. And while their reasoning is sound, it does leave us with little more than their word to substantiate these claims. But even with that in mind, we can look to the operating environment and the needs of the force at the time and, to be honest, see some pretty reasonable rationale for using these aircraft. Of course, the Nighthawk's ability to engage moving targets while flying under the veil of stealth may have been the impetus behind sending these black jets back into the fight, but it wasn't the only benefit these aircraft might offer over sending in some of the nation's more advanced low observable aircraft, and one of the biggest ones may have been the distinct possibility that something could go wrong. America's involvement in counter-ISIS operations over Syria was in support of the local Syrian Democratic Forces, which the US was also backing in their civil war against the Russian-bolstered Bashar al-Assad regime. And while routing ISIS was certainly a high priority for the United States, in terms of strategic global competition, it also represented something of a high-risk to minimal reward operating environment. Despite what you may have read in the comments on Reddit, both the F-35 and F-22 are incredibly safe aircraft to fly. Over 19 years of operational service, there have been 7 F-22 crashes, and 5 of those aircraft were actually written off as too damaged to return to service, out of a total fleet of around 186 jets. The F-35 has seen 9 aircraft lost in crashes since entering service, out of a global fleet of now more than 1,000 aircraft. The F-35, in fact, averages just 1.6 crashes per 100,000 hours these aircraft spend in the sky, with not every crash resulting in a total airframe loss. As a basis for comparison, the F-16 Fighting Falcon has a lifetime average of roughly 3.55 crashes per 100,000 flight hours, or more than twice that of the F-35. The idea that these jets crash often is really just a product of media sensationalism and good old-fashioned recency bias, as stealth jet crashes make for great headlines, and the 24-hour media hyperbole machine didn't exist throughout much of the operational lifespan of fourth-generation platforms like the F-16. But that doesn't change the fact that military aviation is an inherently dangerous enterprise, even in the absence of adversary forces. The F-22 fleet, for instance, has experienced at least 50 Class B mishaps over its 2 decades of service, or incidents that cause serious injury to the pilot or resulted in between $500,000 and $2.5 million worth of damages. Now, these incidents include things like landing gear failures on the airstrip, but also things that aren't caused by any sort of pilot or mechanical failure, so much as good old-fashioned bad luck, things like bird strikes. And it's also really important to remind you that no stealth aircraft is invisible to enemy air defenses, and in truth, Targeting even a stealth aircraft is really just a question of proximity for even dated air defense systems. Publicly disclosed information about Russia's highly touted S-400 Triumph, for instance, suggests that it would struggle to target an F-35 operating more than 20 miles from its high-frequency targeting array. But inside that envelope, the F-35 still presents a large enough target to potentially be engaged. Older, less capable systems present a similar threat, but at much closer ranges. And ultimately, what all this shakes out to mean is that there are no guarantees in combat. Even if you're operating the most advanced and capable stealth aircraft in the world, there's still a long list of things that could potentially go wrong, ranging from pilot error to mechanical failures to enemy action to, again, good old-fashioned bad luck. From a strategic intelligence gathering standpoint, it doesn't matter why an aircraft goes down inside enemy-controlled territory, only that, if it does, it presents adversaries with a technological windfall to both learn more about American systems and to reverse engineer the technology found within them, something we usually call foreign material exploitation, or FME. As such, choosing to fly an F-35 or F-22 directly into hostile territory always comes with important considerations about the value the platform can offer in the fight versus the potential intelligence value of adversary forces observing its operations, collecting data they can use to improve tracking or targeting, and, in a worst-case scenario, recovering a crashed airframe for further study. Now, in a high-end fight, this calculus is simple. That is, after all, the fight these aircraft were designed for. But for the sake of trying to take out a fleeing ISIS commander on the wrong side of the Euphrates, with no real way to hold America's homeland or even its broader strategic ambitions at risk, even a minimal chance of losing an F-35 inside Russian-controlled territory represents a pretty significant strategic risk for what may ultimately be a tactical level reward. And if you find yourself rolling your eyes at the idea of the Defense Department worrying about the minimal chances of an advanced stealth aircraft going down inside enemy territory despite an immense technological advantage, you should know that it's happened before. And in fact, that's exactly why the F-117 may have offered a means to largely eliminate this concern. As the aviation nerds among us already know, back in 1999, a combination of bad mission planning, adverse weather conditions, a skilled enemy commander, and, you guessed it, good old-fashioned bad luck, saw an F-117 shot down over Yugoslavia. We've covered this incident at length in the past, so for the purposes of today's discussion, it's really only important to know that a Russian trade delegation was salvaging material and system components from the relatively intact wreckage within just days of the crash. There was some controversy at the time about the American decision not to conduct an airstrike on the wreckage to prevent this from happening, but by 2017, that was an ancient concern. The damage had already been done. Now, that may have benefited Russian and maybe even Chinese stealth efforts in the intervening years, but it importantly also meant that operating the F-117 over Russian-controlled Syria represented no real threat of foreign material exploitation anymore in the event that one was shot down or crashed for another reason. Now, that alone, of course, wouldn't have been enough to put these aircraft back into combat, but as an addition to that much needed and unique at the time ability to leverage laser-guided munitions to engage moving targets, it does help make the whole idea just a bit more palatable from a strategic standpoint. But by now you may be wondering, how do you get a batch of supposedly retired aircraft all the way out to the Middle East without anyone noticing? Well, relocating a handful of F-117s for these operations actually wouldn't be much of a challenge at all. As Peter Merlin explained in his book, Dreamland: The Secret History of Area 51, this is a challenge the Air Force was managing from the very first day of Nighthawk testing. As each hand-built F-117 rolled off the Skunk Works assembly line, they were then partially disassembled for shipment to Area 51 via C-5 Galaxy cargo planes. These clandestine shipments would occur every 7 to 9 weeks or so throughout the F-117's entire production run, usually at around 10 o'clock at night on Fridays, when commercial air traffic and civilian prying eyes were both at a minimum. Once at Groom Lake, the partially disassembled F-117s would be unloaded and then reassembled by an on-site team from Lockheed to commence flight testing. But that wasn't the only way Uncle Sam secretly moved these black jets around. On October 18, 2002, the US Air Force got caught red-handed trying to sneak a pair of Nighthawks across neutral Austrian airspace by tucking them beneath the wings of a KC-10 tanker under the guise of a flight plan they'd filed for a DC-10, the airliner equivalent of the tanker aircraft. Despite the KC-10 and its Nighthawk wingmen diverting off of their submitted flight plan in an attempt to avoid a pair of Drakens scrambled by the Austrian Air Force to investigate, it was no use. Uncle Sam was busted and a diplomatic row ensued. And while we're not aware of any other time this approach to relocating F-117s over long distances was used, it stands to reason that it likely wasn't unique, and instead, the other attempts were just successful. Alright, so now we know why you might want to send even retired F-117s to the Middle East, and how to get them there. But how would the operations actually go once they arrived? Well, working with the assumption that these F-117s would be flying out of one of a handful of American-controlled airstrips in Qatar or the United Arab Emirates, or potentially even from foreign-controlled airstrips in Saudi Arabia, these aircraft would have to fly between 800 and 1,100 miles to reach targets inside Russian-controlled Syria. With a 5,000-pound loadout, the F-117 has a disclosed unrefueled combat radius of roughly 656 miles, though it's unlikely they'd be carrying that much weight, so you could probably stretch that figure out a bit. Nonetheless, a round trip of between 1,600 and 2,200 miles would mean these aircraft would need to meet tankers at least once per sortie, and likely multiple times, especially if they flew indirectly to operate over water for as long as they could to minimize the chances of being spotted by anybody, friendly or not, in the region. Despite stealth making it possible to operate inside contested airspace, one of the most important and least discussed facets of stealth operations is not done in the cockpit, but rather over maps and intelligence reports long before the sortie begins. Using a variety of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, the US would have mapped out every air defense asset in the region, including their known detection and targeting envelopes. Now, an aircraft's radar cross-section, or the size of its radar return, is not nearly as simple as it's often made out to be online. In reality, an aircraft's radar return is dictated by a long list of variables, some of which even change throughout the operation, including things like angle of observation and radar broadcast frequency. As such, extensive mission planning is done to avoid radar arrays entirely when possible, and to place the aircraft at the optimal angle and altitude to minimize the chances of detection when avoiding those arrays isn't possible. Now, according to the Institute for the Study of War, Russia deployed its first S-400 battery, the most advanced Russian air defense system in service at the time, to Syria in 2015. By August of 2017, at least 2 more S-400s and an S-300 had been added to bolster coverage, with each of their radar arrays integrated with Syrian air defenses, including older systems like the S-200, to maximize coverage and defense. In addition to these big-ticket systems, Russia also deployed several command and control assets for short-range air defense systems, like the mobile Bernal-T, as well as advanced targeting radar arrays to strengthen overall coverage. Now, the majority of advanced Russian air defense hardware was located in the nation's northwest, seemingly more focused on Israeli airstrikes than American ones, but the S-400's claimed 400-kilometer range would have made it possible to detect aircraft as far east as the Euphrates. Likewise, the known position of at least one S-300 deployed to Syria at the time also provided coverage in this area. Another S-300 system that was believed to be positioned in western Syria, but that I could not confirm was there, could have also been a really big concern. With such large detection ranges for Russia's air defense assets, mission planning would have required skirting around shorter-range integrated Syrian air defense systems in the region, while also working to present the F-117s at the optimal angle and altitudes against both local and further-reaching S-300 and S-400 arrays, making for what would have been a very complex operation. After all, we're talking about flying 1983 stealth technology against a Russian air defense system fielded a quarter century later, with anti-stealth capabilities being chief among its design intentions. Now, according to a peer-reviewed assessment by Hellenic Air Force Colonel and electronics engineer Konstantinos Zakidis, published by the Journal of Computations and Modeling in 2014, Russia claims the low-frequency arrays leveraged by their Nebo-M radar, used in the S-400, can detect the F-117 at a range of some 350 kilometers. That's around 217 miles, in an environment free of electronic warfare, and potentially as far out as 72 kilometers, or roughly 45 miles under heavy jamming. This means that without electronic warfare support, these Nighthawks would be operating in the further reaches of where confirmed Russian air defenses could potentially detect them. But importantly, that doesn't mean that they could actually target them. But depending on the degree of integration with more local Syrian systems and the unconfirmed presence of an S-300 in eastern Syria, the chances of being shot down would be well above zero. So, after departing from their home air bases, these aircraft likely would have refueled over the Persian Gulf before setting out over Iraq, where they're said to have also conducted combat operations, and then into Syria from its western border, using automated systems to follow a carefully devised flight plan that would take them around the detection and targeting envelopes of local air defense systems, while presenting the best possible angle of observation for further reaching ones. These aircraft would have engaged targets inside Russian-controlled Syria before turning back to return the way they came, though almost certainly along a slightly different route. And it was during one of these return flights that one of the F-117s allegedly suffered an in-flight emergency, forcing it to land at the Ali El Salam Air Base in Kuwait rather than continuing on. Now, I want to be clear that there is a lot more to all of this than we've discussed in this segment, and a great deal more that we simply don't know. But we can assess with certainty that these operations would have been complex, stressful, and wrought with risk. But with effective mission planning and appropriate external support, there's really no reason to believe it couldn't be done. But that, of course, doesn't mean that it really happened. I gotta be honest with you guys. Last year, when I first mentioned the story of Nighthawks over Syria in my video about the F-117's post-retirement operations here at home, I thought it was a bit of entertaining aviation folklore and really not much more. So, when I decided to delve deeper into these claims over the past few weeks, I had to intentionally check my bias because, to be honest, I just didn't think this story had much merit. But as is so often the case when I start shining a flashlight into the few publicly accessible nooks and crannies of alleged classified operations, I'm often surprised to find a kernel of truth, a basis of fact, or at least some legitimate rationale intertwined with all the online hyperbole and sensationalism. America really does have still classified, nearly silent, stealth Black Hawk helicopters that have been in operation since at least 2011 and have yet to be disclosed to the public. Aurora and the TR-3B may not be real, but evidence does suggest the US was experimenting with high-altitude, high-speed aircraft over the Southwest while these legends were taking hold. The Next Generation Air Dominance program has had technology demonstrators flying for years now, even setting records, but we still don't know what they look like or even what those records were. The truth of the matter is, the US can and does operate aircraft so secret, so classified, that the best we can do sometimes is offer up some blurry photos, rough sketches, or maybe a left-behind tail section as proof that they exist. And while nothing I've uncovered can confirm these stories, that a small cadre of F-117s, operated by the US Air Force or maybe the CIA, were striking ISIS targets in Syria and Iraq in 2017, I'm surprised to say that what I did find left me looking at this story in a completely different light. Do I think these jets really were hunting down terrorists in the Middle East as recently as just 7 years ago? I honestly can't say, but I can tell you that the United States had both good reasons and ample opportunity to do so. Now, it would have been as dangerous as it was difficult, but it also would have been arguably strategically sound, logistically feasible, and maybe even the best option available at the time. After all, we're not talking about fielding a small batch of exotic new stealth aircraft for secret operations. We're talking about flying aircraft we know the US has, aircraft with existing logistical and maintenance support contracts extending out to 2034, aircraft we know are being flown actively as we speak, just in a different part of the world. And if it turns out these stories really aren't true, well, there's something we can learn from that too, about the way we perceive these incredible aircraft. A lesson I was first introduced to by a movie about backyard baseball back when I was still barely tying my own shoes, and that holds true for the F-117 Nighthawk the same way it did for Babe Ruth. Heroes are remembered, but legends never die. And with that ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.